Rave to the Grave.
Hi, this is Vivian, host, and you're listening to Rave to the Grave, a podcast where we take partying very seriously. My guest on today's show is journalist, promoter, weed advocate, protester, and party girl, Michelle Lhooq. Michelle comes from the tradition of provocative first-person female writers like Lydia Lunch, Kat Marnell, or Melissa Broder. She wears everything on her sleeve: who she made out with, what drugs she did, her real feelings about Aphex Twin. Her verite writing and out there social media sometimes pushes the boundaries of good taste and journalistic ethics, and Michelle can be a polarizing figure in the underground. But there's no doubt she is also on the bleeding edge of the cultural zeitgeist. She reports from the deepest corners of the internet and the darkest corners of the rave and the weirdest parts of the drug trip. Most recently, she has been covering LA's weed and psychedelics culture, the Asian rave scene, and following Black Lives Matter and anti-police protests around the USA. She is also the author of Weed, Everything You Want to Know But Are Always Too Stoned to Ask, and throws a party called Weed Rave 420. I caught up with Michelle, and we talked about autonomous zones, Kspray, and rave utopias. Welcome to Rave to the Grave. Michelle, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
We will get into in a minute how we know each other and all the multi-hyphenates of your life and work and partying. But I was actually searching for something that would kind of contain the essence of your personality, and there are many things, but probably nothing is better than this text that you sent me like 20 minutes ago that said, "Okay, running 10 minutes behind. Sorry, this girl I was interviewing literally started making out with me as I was leaving." This is the most Michelle Lhooq thing ever. This does not happen to other journalists on the regular. So I guess let's get this story.
I didn't realize that text was on the record, but okay. So I basically arrived in New York about a month ago, and my intention was to sort of cover some of the political protests that were happening here. And lo and behold, while I was following a march, basically this protester was ambushed by NYPD and kidnapped into an unmarked van. And I was one of the people who tweeted one of the original videos, and my tweet blew up, and it was like a crazy, crazy week. But long story short, I've been trying to get in touch with this protester to ask her what her experience was like and find out what her history is, because she's 18 years old and she's homeless and she's queer and all these things. And, I just feel like I've been such a part of her story. So yeah, today I went to go visit her at her apartment in Harlem that she basically rented, thanks to all the crazy shit that's happened to her. People have reached out, they've donated her thousands of dollars, and some people are sheltering her and stuff. And we had a really cute interview. And then at the end, she started making out with me. And it was really cute, actually, completely unexpected. I can't say that I've actually never hooked up with someone that I've interviewed before the story comes out.
Hey, it's a new era, man. The coronavirus changed a lot of things. I can't believe any, I guess you guys are not strangers by this point, but I can't believe any complete strangers are making out.
I was honestly a little bit, shook, though, because I, for the most part, have been completely celibate and single during this pandemic. And that, sudden burst of intimacy is just, very overwhelming sometimes, You kind of get used to, not touching anyone if you're single, which is really weird and sad, too.
So I think we need to pull it back for a minute, because I know you because we were both working at Vice.
Yes.
And we worked at a division of Vice, or a website that Vice was doing called Thump, which was about electronic music. And no longer exists. I was editing Thump in the early days, and you were writing for me, along with a lot of other great people. But, I never gotten your backstory, and I at once knew you from going to parties and like techno clubs and then knew you from working at Thump. But what came first, the partying or the journalism?
Definitely the partying. I basically grew up shuttling between different international schools in Asia, and it was kind of like Crazy Rich Asians, like very like bottle service VIP, like sneaking out of your house to like go to this really crazy club. And that was just normal in the international school scene. And I think, like looking back, I think about why I was like so attracted to electronic music in particular and like why that was so formative. And I don't think I realized it at the time, but I think I really enjoyed how dance music felt international. A lot of like indie rock, it feels so American, or it just feels so specific and subjective to like an individual experience, which is often, to be honest, like a white man. And so I feel like the universality of dance music, the fact that it often has no lyrics and it's more of like a vibe, I think that was really, really attractive to me in a way that I didn't even fully like put together at the time.
You were in Singapore, or were you literally in multiple
I was between
countries?
Singapore and Tokyo. I spent a little bit of time in China and upstate New York.
So what was your first experience of a party that wasn't a bottle service club or a pop night? Like, what was your first experience of something that was like underground?
Probably when I moved to New York City in college and started going to raves. I can't remember going to raves as a teenager. I think it was pretty foreign to Singapore at the time. But then I moved to New York and started going to Candy Kid parties, like upstate, and like, just taking like shit tons of ecstasies and like going to like bumper car arcades, like classic Candy Kid kind of stuff. And that was definitely the introduction. But I never ever thought that I would end up writing about it, or like it was always just like an escape from academia or escape from reality or whatever. And so it was really shocking to me, I think, to realize that this is something that I could do professionally. I don't want to kiss your ass too much, but I do feel like you were one of the first journalists that I saw like really treating it seriously. Also like having fun and like DJing and being like part of the scene and stuff like that. So I think you were kind of a big inspiration to me.
Kiss my ass. I'll take it. There hasn't been nearly enough kissing of my ass in this pandemic. No, just kidding. But thank you for saying so.
Yeah, and it was so crazy, I think, what we were doing at Thump, at Vice at the time, right? Like treating EDM culture and rave culture as something to be studied and talked about seriously, but not in like a super like, buttoned up the wire kind of way, but in a way that really like, I think spoke to the culture happening on the street, which is what I've always been super interested in. Like, how does rave culture reflect all these other different spectrums and trends that are happening in society?
It was really difficult for me as the editor of Thump because I was trying to bring together these different worlds within electronic music that had gone so far apart. It's like at one point, everything was called house and techno. There was no million different genres, like you would just go to a rave and then the drum and bass DJ would play and then the house DJ would play and then somebody would play breaks and it would all be back to back. There wasn't separate rooms. There wasn't all of this stratification. But at some point now we have, the European techno scene, we have the American techno scene, we have EDM, we have, the bass kids. It's like all of these different things. And they don't really like to consider themselves in the same room a lot of times. So that was like the huge problem of Thump.
But I think what we did really well was treating really dumb things in a smart way and treating really smart things in a dumb way. I feel like that contrast and like really revealing some of the absurdity of this culture and it's like euphoric, beautiful, transcendent beauties equally in one place. That mishmash was really cool.
I mean, one thing that I've always liked about you and liked about your writing is that for me, it's kind of almost in this 60s, 70s tradition of I'm with the band, Cream magazine, like I'm going on tour with Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd, and actually write in my story about doing coke off John Bonham's butt or whatever. It has this like very over the top and extravagant element which exists in partying but kind of gets tamped down when it gets to the journalism part. Which is ironic because every time somebody tries to make like a rave film or like a rave documentary, they're trying to capture all the kind of salaciousness of the underground, but they can never really do it. You can't like capture it on film because it's all these fleeting, private, weird moments and like borderline sus things that happen. And, you know, you put a lot of yourself into your work, like you are a character in your work, and you are also partying and, you know, doing the drugs and sleeping with whoever. And this is in like in the story a lot of times, but that's like very polarizing, I feel. You know, some people are like, this is not, you know, their journalistic standard does not leave for that crossing of the line. So I guess to me, I wondered, what is it to you that you're trying to achieve in your writing or the kind of things you're covering? Like, what's important to you? And also, like, if there were any people that you read or, like, icons to you that are like, oh, you know, this is a writer that I admire, that I want to be in this tradition of these people.
Right. I mean, I love that question. It's very complex, but I think bottom line is that I've always understood things experientially, and I feel like I just don't see any other way to fully understand something without experiencing it, right? And telling it as it is how I just see my work. You know, some people think that I'm being deliberately salacious, but I don't know. I think that there's this illusion of objectivity that often goes on in journalism, and I think more and more people are looking for actually the acknowledgement of subjectivity and to embrace the, you know, the unique lens through which you see the world. And I don't think I fully understood like the disconnect that's going on between the way that mainstream media covers certain topics versus people who, I guess, you know, are a bit more immersive or about it until recently, because of the rise of sort of like social media journalism or live streamers or people who are like not traditional journalists. And I feel like those people are also a bit more immersive in a way. So, yeah, I don't know. I just feel like the way that I tell stories is how I directly experience them. And some of the writers, I guess, who I've always been inspired by, it's a bit cliche, but, you know, I think I want to write like Joan Didion, but live like Eve Babbitt. Like, Joan is probably the bitch in the corner, like smoking a cigarette, like judging everyone and being kind of like off to the side. But Eve was someone who was always in the middle of the party, fucking all the hottest rock stars and doing all of the drugs. And having that combination of criticality but also immersive experience, I think, is something that I want to do. But also, I think more like modern day writers, like Kat Marnell was a huge inspiration. She was like a columnist at Vice, and I loved the way that she like talked about drug use in a really honest way. And Gia Tolentino at The New Yorker, I think, has this sort of like way of capturing the voice of a generation and like explaining like what things in the zeitgeist mean. That's also super inspirational for me. And I love that Gia is like an Asian woman, because I really feel like a lot of the work I do is often done by white men, and they are taken seriously despite their salaciousness. I sometimes wonder if, like, you know, if some of the, like you said, polarized reactions to my work comes from the fact that, like, I look the way that I do, that I am, like, you know, an Asian woman who's not supposed to be smoking weed, doing drugs, doing whatever the things, you know? And I do think it's a part of it, but I don't know.
I mean, it's a whole other podcast probably, but I think a lot about how, you know, a lot of the gatekeepers of the media that are white men or are more homogenous, you know, like the editors of magazines or the people assigning TV news stories or whatever that may be, it affects what kind of like writers they're assigning things to, what kind of music gets taken seriously and what doesn't. You know, like, are they going to assign 3,000 words on like Baltimore Club? Maybe not, you know, but are they going to assign with 3,000 words on like Future Islands or some indie rock band because that's like what that group of people elevates or whatever. That's something that I feel like in my career as like both a DJ and a journalist, like I've struggled with because like, yes, certain things are like lauded, you know, like and talked about in a critical, important way, and certain kinds of music are not. That's interesting. I definitely wanted to know about your influences. And I also want to know when you write these things, it's like sometimes it kind of, there's a lot of backlash. And now with Twitter and everything else, people can directly get at you. And, or, you know, RA, resident advisor, had to like close down the comments because people were just, what was the piece that you wrote for RA that
Aphex
everyone
Twin?
Was freaking out on? Yeah, what did you say about Aphex Twin? I can't remember.
That he was playing other people's music without crediting them. And that sort of secrecy was a bit old guard, right? And people like reacted so strongly to that. I mean, I'm not the first person to say fuck Aphex Twin.
Maybe the first person in a big electronic music newspaper.
Right.
To commit it to print.
Which is why it needs to be said.
I guess what I've always wondered is, does it bother you when people are coming after you in the comments and on Twitter and stuff? Or is that all part of the game and you're like the kind of person that can just let it sort of roll?
I mean,
off
I
your
really
back?
don't deliberately try to be controversial, I swear. It just happens. And I think it used to bother me a lot more when I was younger and maybe tried to like please everyone and also was feeling a bit more insecure about my own expertise or experience. But now I think I believe in my work a little bit more, especially most recently. I think the work that I have been doing, like sort of merging counterculture and rave culture with like the political protest scene, like I'm super inspired by. So I think that the dream of the internet where we thought that we could all be united and all like talk in the same room, and it's crumbling. It's not happening. And what's actually happening, which I think is maybe more interesting, is these sort of like different media bubbles and communities and platforms that are rising that are more independent, more niche, and you find your people and you talk to them. I don't think it's like necessarily the healthiest media environment for everyone to be stuck in their own bubbles, but I do think that there's a lot of value in finding people who are willing to engage in subjects really deeply with you, and have real conversations rather than just reactions, which is unfortunately, I think, how traditional social media is built. I think that's a huge part of it too, you know, the fact that it seems like my work is really controversial. It's really just because the way that Twitter is literally set up to like engender that kind of conflict.
Yeah, you don't get like a think piece on Twitter. You get your 140 characters to like clap back real quick.
That's just the culture, and I hope that it changes because I don't think it's healthy.
So these bubbles that you're talking about, I mean, I have known you for a while now, and I know that you are like in deep, relatively obscure wormholes of like various strains of the culture that you're into, whether that be like the weed culture, the rave culture, protest culture, whatever. So like, what are some of these bubbles that you find yourself in or that are intriguing to you?
I mean, I'm really inspired by some of the communities that are forming on channels like Discord, which is like Slack for gamers or for anarchists and stuff. And I think, yeah, like there are a lot of the protesters are sort of creating Discord groups or Signal groups as a way to communicate about like the news, but also protests, way to like form communities. And they're way more intimate and secretive than what you would find on like, you know, the traditional Instagram, Twitter kinds of things. I mean, IRL groups, I would say that the new world of weed in LA is really fascinating. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to like move there, is to be in the middle of this like really crazy, like rapidly changing world that I think is like very, very defining of our generation, you know?
So what is happening in the new world of weed?
Well, I'm going to just tell you a story of a party that I went to because I feel like it's like, it really captures the vibe. As soon as I moved to LA, basically, we were invited to a party at, I can't remember whose house it was, Helen Mirren's mansion. She doesn't live there anymore, but it used to be hers. And we pulled up and there were like peacocks in the backyard and just like, you know, miles and miles of like luxury cars like lining up. And it was like just so exactly what I imagined, like glam Hollywood to be. But then on top of that, weed. You know, like it was the launch party or something for a video series by Mary Jane, which is Snoop Dogg's weed platform. And so as soon as we pulled up, it was just like beautiful girls, like carrying trays of blunts, like free flow, like weed cocktails and like weed infused food and like Snoop Dogg DJing in the living room and literally like mountains of weed like by the pool, and it just had this like crazy opulence, you know, to it. I've never been surrounded by so much free weed before. It was literally a fantasy.
The dream.
Yeah.
So what is your favorite weed product? Like, I mean, you know, you get to California and you get all of these, not only all the different strains, but like you mentioned, there's like weed food, weed cocktails, edibles, dabs, like the list goes on. What is your favorite thing within the weed world?
Honestly, right now, I'm obsessed. I'm obsessed with CBD suppositories.
Wow. Vaginal or anal? I guess it could be either, right?
Either one, but they're so good for pain. Like, wow. I'm thinking about it right now because my back is kind of painful. I'm like, oh, I wish I could stick CBD up my ass.
I mean, we're going to have to ask Joe the engineer, but you know, I don't care.
But yeah, it changed my life. I've never done any drugs up my butt before.
Really?
No.
Wow.
I've always been scared. But yeah, CBD is very safe. And it was like from a really cute company called Mellow Bottoms.
That's very cute. Yeah. What are some other things that are just kind of like wild that people may have not heard about in the weed sphere?
Well, right now, it feels like a lot of the cannabinoids in weed that are not THC or CBD, which are the two main ones that everyone kind of knows, but there are literally hundreds of other ones, and they are on the come up for sure. Like, I have a pack of joints that contain CBG, which is supposed to make you, like, chilled out and relax, like, actually way more than CBD. Yeah, like you don't get any of the stone, like clouded head feeling. And some of these cannabinoids are like super rare because they're not rare, but you can only find them in really small quantities in weed. And so you hear these crazy stories of people doing like $5,000 dabs of like this really obscure cannabinoid in Vegas. There's definitely also just like this crazy commodification of what used to be a counterculture and now is becoming an industry, right? So that's been like a really fascinating thing to watch. Definitely have like mixed feelings about it, but I still think it's super interesting to also think about the intersection of social justice with weed because of like how much insane inequality and like racial discrimination has gone into the war on drugs. And then that kind of dovetails into dismantling police and all of the stuff that's being talked about politically right now. You know, the police are a major, major factor of like, why the war on drugs has ravaged so many communities. And so, yeah, it all kind of, I think, ties back to this like really interesting case study of like what's going on with weed now and how that can kind of like foretell what could happen in the future when it comes to all drugs.
But isn't there a problem, too, in that weed was this Wild West that was becoming legalized? Isn't there, like, a racial inequality to, like, who controls the legalized weed business?
Absolutely. I mean, it's, like, really gross, actually, if you look at, like, the numbers and just how much of the upper echelon of like the weed industry is just like conglomerates, business people who actually have nothing to do with weed. I mean, there are just so many people of color that had their lives ruined because of the war on drugs. I met a homeless person at an autonomous zone in Philadelphia who was telling me that he lost all of his federal financial aid to go to college because he got caught with half a pound. And he was like, and now there are all these white boys making millions. I was like, yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be a real eye-opener, especially when like everything's opened up again, to kind of see. And now like a lot of people are aware of the sort of racial justice issues that we're facing, and we're going to need the money from legalized weed, frankly. So that's going to probably change a lot of stuff too.
I know, it's so crazy, right? That like weed is going to fuel the future.
Yeah, I mean, kids of the 90s, this was like our dream, right? You know, like when is weed going to be legalized finally? Okay, you mentioned the temporary autonomous zones, and I definitely want to talk about that. And I want to talk about partying more also. But since you mentioned temporary autonomous zones, when did you learn about this idea? And can you kind of explain to people who don't know, what is a TAZ?
For sure. So I learned about it through rave culture. It is a term that was coined by a literary critic, theorist named Hakim Bey. And it literally refers to like a spatial temporal zone where the normal, codes of society are lifted and people are able to both release like social tensions and toxicities, I guess, and traumas. In his definition, it allows regular society to continue. In today's sort of political climate, what's actually happened is that after the George Floyd uprising, it started in Seattle. A bunch of protesters took over a 6-block radius outside of a police precinct after like weeks of really sort of violent clashes with police. And that 6-block radius was outside a police precinct that the police had abandoned during these clashes. So that temporary autonomous zone was like an occupied protest where they had, workshops and free food, and they planted a garden and had like, just music and ways for people to like connect and re-envision a society without police, which is a really radical vision. And from there, the idea just kind of caught on, and it like spread to New York. It spread to Washington, D.C. There was a few in Portland, in Philadelphia. And I became really obsessed with them because, again, like I only learned about them through rave culture. Like raves are also TAZs, right? Because they are these complete like little utopian or maybe dystopian fantasies that allow people to like shirk off some of the oppression that they might feel outside and reimagine a different world. And so to me, thinking about what rave culture might have in common with the political moment, especially during a pandemic when like nightlife and traditional nightlife is not really happening, I was really interested in finding out how maybe some of the social functions of raves or parties, that kind of energy was being transferred into protests, which are also, I think, a place for people to like release some of that trauma and to find like community and catharsis.
It's interesting because that was the idea of the temporary autonomous zone. For me, was so tied in with cyberpunk and all the ideas of cyberpunk culture that were like happening in the early 90s when I was just sort of like imagining going to my first rave. And actually, most of the things that the cyberpunk writers were writing about have happened in one way or another. Like virtual sex has happened. It's just like it happened as like OnlyFans and stuff, not as like suits that we wear. We're like, we're fucking in these suits. But, there's all sorts of virtual sex stuff happening that they were writing about. And like same with smart drugs and different modified drugs and this idea of TAZ too. But have you actually been to parties or raves that you felt like fulfilled this dream of being a temporary autonomous zone? Because they don't all, in my experience.
Yeah, for sure. I think the one that comes to mind was a queer festival called Hole in Berlin. And it was the first time that I've been to a specifically queer festival. Like, we've all been to queer parties, but for a festival to be completely queer, I mean, they actually did take over like a section of land in the outskirts of Berlin with like really dystopian industrial, structures. And then it was also by a lake, so there were like beautiful sunsets and nature. And it was a queer paradise. Everyone was like naked and like, doing whatever they wanted to do. And there was just this completely utopic vibe for sure.
And so are you the kind of person for whom like nothing is really shocking? You say like queer Berlin festival whole and like the Hieronymus Bosch painting like comes to mind. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like, and I'm not like putting any judgment on that way, one or the other, but like that's definitely not for everyone.
I know. I definitely have this like insatiable curiosity about, I don't know, the weirdest, or not even weird, but just like the most maybe extreme fringes of culture. I find these sorts of, I guess, like liminal spaces like very interesting sort of zones to hang out in, because I think they're very intense, they're very volatile. They are definitely like the, I guess, avant-garde, where you like see how ideas that will become really influential later on in the mainstream sort of take shape, right? I feel like the fringes are where the most radical ideas sort of like come into fruition, and then they like seep into mainstream culture and get like watered down a little bit. But if you hang out in the fringes for long enough, you almost feel like you're like prophesying what's going to happen, because you're like, yeah, you just like see all of these different elements of like the culture clashing together and being inspired by each other in real time.
So I was like kind of going through the articles that you had written, and it occurred to me that there is a thread once you see them all together, which is what you're just talking about right now, is kind of looking at these things that are maybe quite ephemeral, like they just don't last very long, or like they're just an idea that kind of never fully pops off. But when you look at them all together, it's sort of capturing the zeitgeist of like those particular, let's say the last 4 years, when I feel like you've been writing much more intensely about these happenings all over the world. So here's just like, these aren't even the full titles of the articles, but here's like the topics that you've written about. Goblin Gabber, Eco Raves, Candy Kids, Queer Love, VR Ayahuasca Experiences, the Evolution of Cannabis Cuisine, and Zoom Nightclubs. I feel like that's a really good sort of encapsulation of like these things that like, apart from, well, I guess we had Candy Kids and Goblin Gabber like 15 years ago, but it's really sort of like of the time. And I did also want to mention to people that you have interviewed Halsey and Grimes and Miha and David Lynch and Chelsea Manning, who you may remember as the trans intelligence officer in the Army who leaked the U.S. secrets to WikiLeaks, and who you hung out with at a rave.
Yeah, we went raving together because she is a DJ and she grew up listening to drum and bass, and rave culture has always been like a place where she has found herself as a queer person and allowed her to like survive solitary confinement and torture basically in prison. And so I was like, wow, what an interesting insight into her political psyche, And we ended up going out to a festival where she was giving the keynote speech. And yeah, it was a really intense experience because at one point, like we went to go see this artist named Yves Tumor, who's like very like industrial, intense noise. And she got really like freaked out. She couldn't be in that space because of her PTSD. And then, yeah, there were other moments where she just really like connected with the music, and raving with Chelsea Manning is something that I'll never forget, basically.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because this kind of ties back into the autonomous zones, but also the idea of rave escapism. it's interesting because rave escapism is like really looked down upon as like, you just go to raves and you do drugs and then nothing comes of it. It's been talked about like, oh, it's not a political act. It's just like you going and partying and doing drugs and being destructive. And I was interested to kind of talk about that with you because you've partaken in rave escapism in like destructive forms, also in like life-changing forms, and then also now with that turning into some combo of rave and protest.
Yeah, my thoughts on this subject are kind of complicated right now, actually. I think pre-pandemic, I was full on for rave escapism and its ability to sort of allow us to envision alternate futures and alternate ways of being. And that's what I really loved about a lot of the specifically like queer rave spaces that were forming and that were very, very strong in New York is that, yeah, like the rules of society were in a way reversed and we were able to live in these like paradisical, like temporary autonomous zones and sort of like experience what that kind of like radical vision would actually feel like. And drugs have taught me like so much also, you know, specifically psychedelics. But at the same time, I think everything kind of changed with the pandemic. And one thing that I think is very interesting and a line of inquiry that I definitely want to explore more is how a lot of the autonomous zones that I've been to require or at least encourage people to be sober, and that drinking and doing a lot of drugs is seen as antithetical to the seriousness of the political moment. And often they do kind of like take over a little bit at the end of these spaces, like, you know, lifespans, they always kind of like become druggy spirals. And it does sort of legitimize it. And I think some organizers feel like what distinguishes this moment from the 70s is that drugs aren't necessarily seen as like a subversive act inherently. And so coming to New York, I think I was really, really interested in seeing how the New York rave scene would be responding to this political moment. But anyway, like coming to New York, I do feel, of course, that like many ravers and rave collectives are, you know, collaborating with protesters to throw marches and fundraising and doing various things. But I just feel like a lot of people are really deep in the drugs right now, and that sort of like immobilization literally is not letting them mobilize to the fight. And there's also been a very interesting backlash against anybody throwing any kind of rave right now because of the pandemic. So it makes everything really complicated, right? Like rave culture to me has always been strongest as a way to like create a community of people, bring people together, provide the sort of like healing, like catharsis of all the trauma and oppression that we absorb every day, literally like released through dance, through movement. And I do think that those functions are really, really necessary right now. But there's also this moral moratorium on social gatherings. And yeah, I just feel like rave culture is struggling to find its place in this political moment.
It's been crazy to me. You know, as somebody that like promotes parties myself, I've been doing a lot of thinking about what is like personal responsibility and what is like a promoter's responsibility or a nightclub's responsibility. Because like, yes, there have been a couple renegade raves. Mm-hmm. I went to the first one on July 4th. And I was really shocked. Maybe this is naive of me, but I thought that everybody would be wearing masks. There's been so much talk. Like New York is such a politicized club culture. There's so much awareness of like political issues. There's so much talking about safe spaces. There's so much like talking about the community and looking out for the community that I guess I naively thought, okay, everyone's going to wear a mask and then we can have raves. Like we can have something nice. You know, but it wasn't the case. No mask on, sharing drugs, sharing drinks with complete strangers, not the people they were living with. And I was just like, first of all, where is this like community? Second of all, I thought you loved bondage aesthetics. Why are you not wearing masks? Like, it's all been like bondage aesthetics and like fetish parties. Like, you wore a mask before, to bound or whatever. Like you were talking about, Rave is a microcosm of what's going on in mainstream society, which is like, to me, struggling with, on one hand, like personal freedoms. Our personal freedoms are being taken away. So where is that line? And then also like caring about other people and like trying to make this society go forward, i.e. wearing a mask so that another person doesn't get sick.
I know, I worry that not wearing a mask is now edgy. Because a lot of young people, it's especially young people, I think, are the most guilty of like these mask-free raves. And I think as a result, also something like kind of worrying that I'm seeing is that like the word rave is being used to describe any kind of irresponsible party, even if the music isn't even electronic. Like there was a so-called rave that was written about in the New York Post recently that was like in Prospect Park. And I think it was a hip hop party, but they called it a rave because now in people's mind, it's like this rave mania, rave phobia. And it's sad to me that...
Well, the 90s are back, Michelle.
I know!
This is exactly what happened. Rave phobia is what happened, in the end of the 90s and beginning of 2000s and really shut down the club culture in New York, shut down the club culture in LA. Also, like, demonizing anything, related to rave. And, like, I hate to say because I will be voting for Joe Biden, but like, with crack house law and everything, he was kind of instrumental in some of those crackdowns. It's weird to me because I feel like, we're living through this like all over again, basically.
Of course.
But now the pandemic is the driver.
I know. I mean, the pandemic just totally warps the whole equation too.
So what are these drugs that everybody is on? Because I'm in the kind of veteran raver category, and the people around me are, not all of them, but like a lot of them are pretty much being pretty sober. And like, I've had the most wholesome summer ever, I think this has been an opportunity for a certain segment of the culture to kind of like clean up their act since there's no temptation. But what are you experiencing?
The opposite, where people are
Tell
spiraling.
me about the Kspray.
Yes. So Kspray is ketamine nasal spray that I sort of got introduced to maybe like 2 years ago, right around the same time that ketamine was becoming like a medicine at ketamine clinics, So I thought it was really interesting that they were kind of coming into popularity at the same time. Ended up writing an article about it for this really cool psychedelic magazine called Double Blind that's run by two dope women. But yeah, like it definitely is like a harm reduction tactic in a way because it's cleaner and it allows you to like measure your doses better. And I would say that ketamine is definitely the trending drug in New York right now. I remember just like seeing that evolution from cocaine to ketamine and like basically pre-pandemic, if you went to a rave, like nobody would give you coke. You would not find it. And that's a huge change in the club culture, right? In terms of the vibe going from like super aggressive, like kind of tweaked out coke into very like laid back, almost like dissociated ketamine vibes. That was definitely the defining trend of 2020. But what's happening now in the pandemic is because I guess people are just looking for ways to get even more fucked up. What all the girls are basically like really panicking or worried about right now is that injecting ketamine is becoming a thing. And I think the people who are doing it are like, young and like fabulous and queer and sort of glamorizing it, doing it out in public at parties, on the streets and stuff like that. So I don't know. That's definitely a concern. It's not the first time that needles have come into the rave scene, but it always is worrying when that happens. And then there's GHB.
Is that rearing its head again?
Yeah, I would say it was becoming like a huge, huge thing in New York before the pandemic. And a lot of the like rave elders, I guess, were like talking about how to deal with it, and like Some people felt like the best way forward was to ban it completely and not allow anyone to be caught with it. And then others were arguing for a more harm reduction approach of like educating people and giving out like, syringes for people to measure the dose so that they don't accidentally OD, because G is a substance where literally a couple drops can make a huge difference. And in LA, I would say the top trending drug is shrooms. I actually asked my dealer for some data, and he told me that by far, everyone is doing shrooms a lot more. And he said that ecstasy usage would go up on the weekends where there were major live streams.
Oh my God, how funny. How funny is that? I'm glad you asked, because this is the kind of info. We can talk about, cyberpunk aesthetics and autonomous zones, but we also just need to talk about what's happening in these streets with the ravers, or should I say in these homes. Yeah, there's been a lot of different kind of iterations of what going to the club means during this pandemic. But I'm glad you brought up California and New York, because when you say you came back to New York, you used to live here. How long ago now did you move to California?
3 years ago.
3 years ago. So a lot of your writing, especially when you first moved to California, was sort of reactionary to you being on this opposite coast and being like California sober, which we'll get to in a minute, but kind of experiencing this scene that is so different, in the drugs, in the people, and everything to what is going on in like the dank, dark techno club of New York, What did you kind of encounter when you went to LA that was like, tell me about your life when you were living in New York, and then what happened when you moved to LA, party-wise?
Sure. I mean, New York was just nonstop, like 3 to 4 parties a night, like drug-fueled, something to come up, something to like come down, something to like temper those two different polarities just constantly. And just knowing everybody and like walking through every door, And then California was basically the complete opposite, where I decided that I needed to go sober, what I called California sober, which was a really interesting experiment of like only smoking weed and doing occasional psychedelics, and then going to a lot of weed parties and discovering the weed industry through that way. And not knowing anyone and kind of feeling like LA was so decentralized. The rave scene there is like not connected in the way that New York is, like, so everyone's on top of each other, right? Whereas in LA, I feel like they're just like these little bubbles where everyone's kind of doing their own thing quietly. And I was always like searching for the scene. And there are micro scenes, but there isn't like a huge community.
Yeah. Okay, so I have to also tell people that you've thrown a couple of weed raves. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of taking some of the things that you would get at raves, like the DJ aspect of it, the community aspect of it, maybe a weird space that's not a club, making the focus on cannabis instead of any of these other like club drugs. Mm-hmm. And I have to tell you, my first reaction to that was like, because I'm a person that like, I just get like tired and like really mellow when I smoke weed. And I know people try to be like, oh, there's different strains. If you just smoke, like if you just smoke sativa, then you'll be hyper. I'm like, no, I've been smoking weed for 25 years. Yeah. Like I would know by now.
I know, and I think it was a very interesting social experiment as well to see how the vibe would change if you just made weed the main substance. And I was really worried about that too. I was like, oh shit, is everyone just gonna like fall asleep and like stare at walls and act really weird?
Or like not talk? I don't
know. But to my surprise, I mean, I found it to be one of the most communal rave experiences that I've had. Like, I mean, obviously this was pre-pandemic where we could share joints, but just the act of smoking weed is like very like a shared experience. You know, you share lighters, you share joints, like you stand in a circle, you talk. I think it really allows people to like let their guard down and soften and open up in a way that like feels really intimate. And that's a really playful space, I think, to be in at a rave compared to other drugs that might make you a bit more like edgy and like, you know, sharp, like thorny in a way. But weed is like very soft. And I think that was one of the best parts about throwing that party is like creating this sort of different energy that I could see like strangers like opening up to each other and stuff.
And people aren't stingy about sharing weed. I mean, especially not in California.
Yeah.
It's not like other drugs, like, Coke, where somebody's trying to be like, don't do my shit. Like people are like, here, have a nut.
Totally.
And smoke.
I know. And I think that one of the things I also wanted to do is bring this like opulent, like sense of infinite bounty to the party. So I would always get sponsors and they would give out free samples of weed. So literally there would just be like so much free weed, just everywhere, just flying in the air. And at my party, we found ways to make it feel kind of hedonistic sometimes too. Like I once had a bartender who wrote a book about creating energy cocktails, and she created a special cocktail for us that had weed, like Blue Dream strain, like infused with an Adderall rim.
Wow. Mix and match.
Yes.
That's when you have to, like, your term paper is due or something? Your article is due?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was perfect.
That's kind of like the Michelle Lhooq signature cocktail right there. Like, I got to get this article done, but also got to get high. So what? Now what do I do? I was really interested in some articles that you wrote from the Asian kind of festival or party scene, which sort of you did not long before the pandemic, I guess, 6 months or a year. Well, first of all, where did you go? But I also wanted to know what was going on in Asia that was different than you might have seen in California or New York or Berlin or any of the kind of obvious centers.
Yeah, so I go back to Asia pretty regularly, like to Singapore, and then I travel around the region. And I think most recently, I decided that I was just going to spend a whole month in Thailand and kind of research their weed scene because they were the first country in Southeast Asia to legalize medical marijuana. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that it was very, very inspiring for me to be in Asia because it allowed me, to experience what it's like to be on a dance floor with all people that look like me. And there's this really cool, like, energetic, young, like, fresh, and, like, political vibe over there that I think I don't feel as much here because, honestly, like, the stakes aren't as high. Like, there, like, in many of the countries, being gay is illegal. And so you really do have this sense of, like, I guess, escape, but also, like, resistance by going to these parties. I also think that it's really cool that in the last few years, all of these parties have started creating their own sort of micro networks and like regional networks that aren't even necessarily in dialogue with America or the West. And I think that's really cool to go there and see like, wow, all these like communities and networks are forming that are focused distinctly on like Asian sounds and Asian culture within the rave context. Even Singapore, that's like this, super totalitarian like country, like major police state is having their own like micro rave scene pop up. And a couple years ago when I went there, there was like a rave going down next to like a Bitcoin factory with all of these young sort of like artistic local Singaporean kids like creating this culture for themselves because it hadn't existed before. And yeah, I mean, I feel like one rave experience that I had in Thailand that was really, really eye-opening to me was this festival called Wonder Fruit that was created by a bunch of Thai promoters. And they specifically bring in like Thai disco music and like Thai bands to play, and they create all of their structures out of sustainable materials. It's all eco-friendly, but it also has this like really like hedonistic rave vibe. And going to their party, which also had like speakers and workshops during the day, like focused on wellness, kind of gave me the inspiration to throw my own weed rave, because one thing that we do with my party is really focus on like daytime workshops and talks, as well as like yoga wellness, and to combine, I think, wellness, spirituality, and like environmentalism into rave culture feels very future forward to me.
It's cool that what you experienced was run, for instance, by Thai promoters. Because I think historically, one thing that's happened is it's like these expats in, Shanghai or Singapore, or even Thailand, if you think about the Full Moon Beach Party and all that stuff, that like often it was like a British expat or something that's like throwing the club or the rave, or maybe even just the thing that gets written about, or the thing that gets sort of like publicized. And I had wondered if in this new wave or this next wave that it was more local and it was people from there, making the music, DJing, throwing the parties. And also, what's the kind of class situation? Are these parties available to people of different like economic levels, or are they only kind of for the upper echelon who can afford the festival ticket?
Yeah, definitely. There's an element of this being a culture of like rich kids, which is definitely a thing in Asia right now, right? A lot of families have become wealthy very quickly. And there's this whole new generation of like party club kids. But I think about this a lot, actually, about how like rave tourism can be a form of white colonialization that has always happened. Even if you think about like Goa trance and how it brought all of these like white people into this like remote part of India where they just like took over land, and just like the idea of like importing EDC and like all of these like, white brands into Asia as the main form of like nightlife there. I think that was the status quo for a really long time. But it's exactly what you said. Like the fact that it's now grassroots, local, really focusing on, the intersection of like Asian culture with electronic, futuristic, dystopic sounds. Like, I mean, I love what this one band, Gabber Modus Operandi, is doing in Bali, where they're like taking really like traditional Indonesian sound and mashing it with gabber. This is like so fresh, and this is what I think Asia is really like giving right now.
So, we've touched on it a couple of times, but I think I've had a lot of younger friends who are missing partying so terribly because of coronavirus and the pandemic. And, the club scene is in this state of like, are there even going to be clubs? When are there going to be clubs? A bunch of my DJ friends, lost a ton of money. They don't know when they're going to work again. They don't know when they're going to play festivals again, etc. But I'm always like, well, parties are always going to exist because it's like human nature to want this escape or this situation that's like out of time and out of the norm. Like this was happening in the medieval times, like with carnival and stuff. It's like, it's ritualistic. It's part of being human. Like it's never going to end. It might not look the same, but it's like, it's kind of like human nature to like create a party and want that ecstatic dance, experience, which can also lead to a transformation in your personality and in your normal quote unquote life, except we don't have normal lives because we basically seamlessly go between the party and not the party. Right. I've definitely been like at work on, in the club, eaten in the club, slept in the club, talked to my mom in the club,
lived and died in the club.
Rave to the grave. Rave to the grave. That's why we're here. That's why this podcast exists. So I want to take a break for a second and just ask you like the fanzine type questions, because you've probably been to more parties than most people. So what do you feel like are the best, 2 to 3 parties you've ever been to in your whole life?
Oh my gosh. Probably the ones that spring to mind are just like the ones that were in really unconventional spaces. Soul Skate in Detroit is one of the best parties, I think. It is a skating rink where this iconic Detroit DJ Moody Man will play disco, and you just see like skate crews from all over the country. I mean, we've been there together. It's iconic. I don't know, there was a rave that Telfer threw in a White Castle during Fashion Week that really kind of, I think, represented a certain moment in time in New York nightlife and culture. And for a designer like Telfar, like on the come up, you know, that was really iconic. And then I don't know if I want to, I'm just going to plug my own party, but do you remember that rave that you played in the fried chicken?
The vape rave.
Yes,
we still talk about it. Do I remember it?
It was so iconic. And also a timestamp of like Bushwick rave in like the mid 2010s.
It was, didn't it happen in January?
Yes.
Okay, it happened in January, and after you threw this party, we were like, this is the best party of the year, even though it's only January. It was in the back of a fried chicken place, and that was operational. That's a party spot here in Brooklyn. And you can pop out and get fried chicken if you want. But anyway, everyone had different flavored vapes. This was back when people were really excited about vaping.
Before the vape
And
date.
I don't smoke, but I must have smoked like, I don't know, 17 different vapes, because people would be like, this one's Captain Crunch, this one's Cotton Candy, this one's like Turbo Berry. And this is like the antithesis of pandemic time, where you can't like share a joint or a vape. But I mean, like, complete vaping, strangers' vapes. And like, you kind of had like different DJs from all different sort of very underground genres. Like Jubilee and I played grime, and then
every hour was a different genre.
Yeah, like every hour was a different genre. And so like that's, yes, we definitely still talk about that party, because there hasn't really been anything quite like that.
I just got all of the sickest DJs that I knew to team up and play back to back. And I think that was also a moment for me to realize like what creating a party really is. It is like gathering communities and like depicting or capturing a sort of scene, capturing a moment in time. And yeah, nothing like that has happened, I think, because most people usually throw parties according to like their friends and their sort of like groups or whatever. Whereas I think that I was trying to portray like, now that I think about it, so many parties have tried to do that too. So I'm not the only one that's done it. Like I think a lot of the rave lineups that I saw, especially in the last 2 years, just seem like such an interesting like puzzle piece of all these different micro scenes that were coming up in Brooklyn nightlife.
Yeah, I mean, a party is like in the best of times, you throw all these different people together and like they have an amazing time and forge these new relationships, and it works. But like often it doesn't work, because like when you throw a bunch of disparate things together, like sometimes it's just
totally.
awkward.
And I think what makes a party like really work actually is creating a world. It's more than just like trying to throw a bunch of people together and hope that some kind of vibe happens. It's like having a concept and having an aesthetic and having an ethos and like even a code of conduct, right? Like a shared sense of rules that everyone kind of plays by in order to like create something transcendent and liberatory. But I've been thinking a lot actually about like code of conduct and like how they shape rave spaces, doorkeeping, sort of like borders and barriers to entry, especially when it comes to like autonomous zones as well. One thing that I think is really interesting, this is like such a random thought, but I just had it earlier, is that like raves tend to be more like internal focused, where you have this like rules, but they're dictating how to act within the space, whereas autonomous zones usually have a list of demands that they want to impose on the outside world. And they're trying to actually affect how outside world operates. But yeah, I think in both cases, having that sort of like list of like some kind of manifesto is pretty integral to creating that kind of intentional space.
That's really interesting, because I do think that manifestos were a really big part of the early rave scene, and and really important. But for me, parties that have a lot of rules, I don't go to a party to have rules imposed on me. Like my whole life as an American is people constantly telling me what I can't do all the time. It's very unfreeing. Like every public space is often rule bound, like if you go to a park, someone owns it. It's somebody's property. You can't do this. You can't do that. I liked raves because they were like a free place. You could be a freak. You could just do whatever you wanted. And there's a danger in that too, in that there are people who are going to exploit that, for their own gain. People with like shitty ideals and shitty morals and stuff, but freeing at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, I think the most important code of conduct rules that I usually see are just around respect and like consent and stuff like that. Because what's scary about nightlife also is that it can often be like a toxic, shadowy, stewy place for like bad actors to hide underneath all of the drug use and the cloudy, aura that surrounds that. But I'm really curious about what the rave manifestos used to be. Were they also around consent, or were they about different sorts of rules?
Well, I guess what I'm thinking of is things that are from the time where rave was totally new, so people really believed that it was going to change the world, and it was very much piggybacking off the 60s and sort of 60s hippie movement ideals, sort of like Plur before there was Plur. So I think the manifestos were very like Daisy Age and very much about like seeing into a new world and not mentioning psychedelics, but like very psychedelic in their language and their outlook. Like we're going to, transform ourselves via this party and look into the new world. And it was all about like sort of this utopian space or utopian future. Thinking about those things and consciously trying to make a party that, it might not succeed, but I think that's a cool mandate to like put forth rather than like a list of rules.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I wish that people did that more now. I feel like it would actually help people understand how to behave. Because I don't think there are rules of the rave, but I do feel like there is a code of conduct that you kind of pick up if the longer you go to parties. It's just being respectful, being chill, being open, and like, I don't know, the whole rave experience is so much about collectivity over, individual ego. And I feel like a lot of the conduct just kind of revolves around that idea. Also, you mentioned Plur earlier. I've been thinking a little about Plur, which is peace, love, unity, respect, which are, I guess, the 4 pillars of rave ethos, I guess.
We could say that.
They're like one of the first rave rules that I learned as like a little young raver. And I love them. I think they're so like beautiful. But don't you feel like they just seem kind of soft? Like especially... I think because of all of the work that I've been doing, thinking about political resistance, like I would love for some of the ethos of rave to be rethought a little bit, to think of rave not only as peace, love, unity, respect, but also rave as political resistance, rave as disruption. Like some of the protesters that I've been hanging out with have been going outside of like the police commissioner's house or Mayor de Blasio's house and throwing like pop-up noise raves basically, right? And like blasting music into these like really bougie houses as a form of protest. And they feel like it just makes sense to them, to throw like, I guess, a rave in this context. I would love to see more of that happening as we go into this really weird dystopic future that we're kind of barreling into.
I feel like before, in the last couple years, the crew melting point from New York have really been championing that idea. Like they threw a couple parties, free parties outside of the ICE headquarters here in New York in like Foley Square, which is also a huge protest site at the moment, and also kind of the site of Occupy, like the Black Lives Matter Occupy, not Occupy Wall Street, but they really like playing this kind of like 200 BPM gabber outside ICE, you know, who are the organization that are basically targeting immigrants and putting them in cages and, you know, sending people home without their kid, like back to Mexico without their kids and all this. It really did feel like, yeah, this is a whole part of like what the scene is about. Because like a lot of us got into raves because we didn't feel right in a proper club, or we didn't feel accepted in some VIP bottle service place, or maybe in our school, or we weren't part of the popular kids, like we're something else. And for me, like raves were the place where all the like weirdo kids would go. So before there was ever a rave look that you could buy into, it was like, you know, every kid that was like weird in your high school would like end up at the raves. Skater kids, punks, you know, like queer kids who, you know, didn't belong, like kids who's like were latchkey kids and their parents were never around. It was like, you know, the island of misfit toys. And, you know, I think that's like a powerful sort of coming together. But it kind of gets lost because, you know, you get too far on the partying side and then people are like too fucked up to protest, like you said.
I know. But I mean, the protesters themselves get it and love the idea of protest raves. So I don't know. I think it'll be really interesting to see how the rave community continues to collaborate with these activists, as well as the protesters themselves, just like throwing their own prop-up raves and defining a new version of rave culture that might be the next evolution from, I mean, honestly, like the nightlife in New York right before pandemic was becoming very like industry commercialized in a way, right? Like it was very much like a business. But what's going on now is like so anarchic and chaotic and lawless. Like it's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, when you take the ability to make capital out of the equation, then you get, you know, it's not about the money, then it's got to be about something else. You know, you as a person that kind of has tread on many edges and lived on the edge and been to several edges and back, like do you, whether that's, you know, with partying and drugs or with like hardcore protesting and the burnout there, is there anything good about like taking stuff to the point of extreme sometimes?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I feel like these spaces are where you feel the most alive and also just act as the front lines to like understanding larger picture situations or ideas, conversations that are happening in the culture. And they are very like paradoxical places sometimes. Like they're not always easy to navigate because they contain so many contradictions and just sort of like sometimes can be like hard to form a coherent narrative from. But they're also just like so visceral and so like vibrant and alive. Yeah, I think that they are the most essential places, I think, in the culture. And that's why I love to hang out in them.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I have to ask this question. It's like we've been talking about all of these beautiful cerebral topics, and I love that. But I also want to know, what is the highest that you've ever been in your life?
Probably the one time that I smoked DMT with my friend John, who was like our DMT shaman in his apartment. And it was a transcendent experience that, I mean, I don't know if you've ever smoked DMT. I know I
have not, and I probably will never.
Well, DMT is like the concentrated form of ayahuasca. And it's, I consider it a really new technology because we've only been able to do this for like a couple decades. And you just blast off into another complete dimension. And I spoke to, I don't know if it was God or an alien, but it was like a creature. And she reassured me that like I had been to this space before and that like, you know, I knew her somehow. And long story short, I know I sound totally whacked out, like telling you this story, but this experience changed my life because it made me believe in like an afterlife, in a God, in a sort of, it was the definition of a spiritual experience. And, you know, I've sought spirituality through so many different ways. Like I was raised super Catholic. Rave is obviously a form of religion as well. But this was like the most direct experience that I've ever had, literally talking to God. And it just made me like double down on my sort of belief in psychedelics as a spiritual medicine, which connects also to like the idea of rave collectivity and communion, and how, you know, these spiritual experiences that you experience on psychedelics and on like dance floors just sort of gestured towards us being part of something bigger than ourselves. And that's so beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I've often said to people that like raves are my church because I think that I get out of them what I see that other people get out of church.
Yeah.
You know, like there's a communal aspect, there's like a kind of, can be sometimes like a kind of worshipful aspect. Not so much like worshiping the DJ, not for me anyway, but like worshiping kind of like being alive and like being alive together, you know? And like, I think rave is church for whole generations of people for whom church is not relevant or not accepting or not something they would get into, but humans still need that, you know?
I know, which is why I think raving in a pandemic has become so fraught, because it's so needed, but it's also so prohibited. It's so hard. I can't really wrap my head around this. Problematic.
Well, you know, we're almost out of time, but I kind of also feel like by the next time we meet, there will be 30 or 40 other permutations of dance music and this culture and like ways to club, like, you know, a couple months ago, like club quarantine, like live stream Zoom raves happened, and now we're over here. So I feel like things are evolving at a rapid rate. I did want to let people know that they can follow your newsletter, which is called Rave New World, a newsletter that looks at the intersecting futures of nightlife, weed, and counterculture, which is kind of like your up-to-the-minute reportage and like you writing about stuff that maybe no magazine wants to commission or like doesn't want to touch, but is like interesting for you. So if you want to hear more dispatches from the front line,
field notes from the front line
of all of these things, you can subscribe to Michelle Lhooq's newsletter, Rave New World, and also check out her book, or maybe buy her book for a younger member of your family, which is Weed, Everything You Want to Know But Are Always Too Scared to Ask.
Too stoned to ask.
Oh, too stoned to ask. Even better. I was too stoned when I read that book title. Yeah, I guess I need to go back and study that slightly. But yes, you're the author of a book as well. And what's like the next thing? I know you're itching to get out of the toxic and insane New York, but what kind of projects are in your future?
Well, it's very interesting because I've come to the end of this summer tour that I've been embarking on since, I guess, 2 months ago, of following various autonomous zones around the country. And I just went to the last one in Philadelphia earlier this week. So after this, I'm back to LA with a quick stop in Minneapolis because there's a media collective there that I want to check out called Unicorn Riot that's been covering all the protests. But I don't know what's next for me. You know, I feel like this is the question that everyone is kind of thinking about right now. It's so hard to plan. I mean, I think my instinct is to continue the trajectory that I've been following of like covering protests through the lens of subcultures and queer cultures. And so things are going to get so crazy with the elections coming up that I just know that before long, something is going to pull me out of LA again, probably another autonomous zone.
Maybe there'll be a giant autonomous zone where we can all, you know, like people used to drive like 8 hours to go to a rave. Like I definitely did. So like maybe we're going to have to, I've already seen that people are willing to travel longer distances to kind of get out of the city or to find a party or to reconnect with their friends. And I'm kind of wondering if it's going to be like a bus load, like the 60s, like we all get on a school bus and we go to the autonomous zone, in the middle of conservative Iowa or wherever, and just...
Oh my God, yes, let's start our own autonomous zone!
Rave to the Grave is recorded at the historic Newsstand Studios at Rockefeller Center in New York City. The show is hosted and produced by me, Vivian Host. Our engineer is superstar Joe Hazen. Our theme song, and all additional music in this episode, is by Star Eyes. You can listen to Rave to the Grave on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on this and other episodes, check us out on the web at ravetothegrave.org. or follow us on Instagram at ravetothe.grave. Until next time, permission to party.